Hello, everyone. I'm Becca, dietitian by trade, mom 24/7, wife from the start, and when there's a few extra hours in the day, you might find me hitting the trails or on horseback.
And I'm Kara, a therapist to women, a mom to a boy, an entrepreneur, mountain junkie, and a postpartum runner.
And this is Fit for a Queen, a podcast that's devoted to the female athlete wanting to balance the teeter-totter of all the things we desire out of life as women: performance, health, intellect, and taking time for self, even if we only get 1 minute out of the day.
We're so excited to be bringing you the queens in the athletic world who have done just that. Okay, ladies, take a seat at your thrones, grab your crowns, and welcome to Fit for a Queen. Patrick Wilson is an associate professor of exercise science and directs the Human Performance Laboratory at Old Dominion University. He earned a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Minnesota and completed postdoctoral trainings in sports nutrition at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Wilson has authored over 45 scientific articles that span the discipline of exercise, science, sports nutrition, and health. He's the author of the recently released book, The Athlete's Gut, The Inside Science of Digestion, Nutrition, and Stomach Distress. Wilson is also a credentialed registered dietitian. So, Patrick, tell us, why the gut? We feel like we should call you the gut guy. What got you interested in the gut?
It's sort of a long, winding history there. You know, when I was in graduate school and trying to figure out what to do for my PhD project, I ended up kind of honing in on a topic related to what's called multiple transportable carbohydrates. And that's, essentially just ingesting different sugar types to maximize absorption and carbohydrate burning during prolonged exercise. And one of the measures of that study that I did in the lab had to do with basically just gut symptoms, how much nausea, how much bloating, fullness, cramping were the runners experiencing when they were on the treadmill ingesting these different sports beverages that I was giving them. From there, I kind of started doing some other projects, mostly related to nutrition, where I would ask about, gut problems and issues. And eventually I just started to get a sense that it is really an important issue that affects so many athletes, so many runners, so many individuals, and how they feel and how they perform, that it started to make up more and more of my sort of research time that I devote my resources to. A couple years ago, I kind of decided I want to write a book. I initially thought maybe something with sport nutrition, heavily focused, but figured out pretty quickly that there are a lot of sports nutrition books already. Many of them are very good. So I didn't know that I'd be adding a whole lot of new stuff to the equation. And I kind of settled on focusing specifically on the gut because there aren't any, at least at that time, there weren't any books exclusively devoted to that issue that affects so many athletes. So that's kind of a little bit of the backstory in terms of how I arrived at writing the book, The Athlete's Gut. But it's something that my interest has been evolving over the last, 5 to 10 years with just the research that I've been doing as a student first, and then now as a faculty member.
Well, I mean, I can tell you in my clinical practice when I work with athletes, that's probably 50% of the reason they come to see me is they're having some difficulties with tolerating certain sports products or taking in recovery nutrition. Or on the flip side, we see them starting to cut out food groups or particular foods because they're having GI issues. And so then they end up kind of malnourished or, in energy imbalance. And it all goes back to optimizing the gut health. So I'm excited to have this resource that, can refer them to.
Yeah, it's an underappreciated organ in many ways. I think that's changing a lot now. And there's more and more health practitioners and sports dietitians who are really appreciating the importance of the gut. But, you kind of think in athletics, the primary focus is with training and making people stronger and fitter, lowering their body fat or improving the quality of their diet so that they can run harder. But if you don't have a functioning gut, it makes it pretty hard to do all that other stuff. So It's one of the foundational things that, you can't take for granted, because otherwise it can have some pretty negative impacts on your health and performance if it really gets out of whack.
Right. Especially in those more endurance, like a lot of the triathletes that I work with, like that's one of the main culprits that throws them out of the race is like all of a sudden they're curled up in a ball. So can you share with our listeners the breakdown of your book so they can kind of get an idea of the vast topics you cover in relation to gut health?
Definitely. So at first, when I was deciding that I wanted to write a book on the gut, I was worried I might not be able to get kind of a full book out of it, but I soon realized that I almost had the opposite problem, that I needed to find a way to fit everything in because there was so much information to cover. But it's basically in three parts. Okay, the first part is a anatomical and physiological overview of the gastrointestinal system. Now that may sound pretty dry and boring, but I try and make it pretty interesting and humorous where possible. And then another part of that first section of the book, I go through the specific types of issues that athletes oftentimes encounter. So starting with things like nausea, regurgitation, reflux, heartburn, bloating, cramping, constipation, loose stools, bloody stool, side stitching, basically any problem you can think of that impacts athletes. I try and explain why do those things happen, how common are they, and then provide some suggestions about how you may be able to go about preventing or managing some of those specific issues. Because I think it's really important to remember that these issues can be very different between athletes. Okay, nausea and loose stools and bloating are not the same symptom, meaning they may have different solutions. Okay, so that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is all nutrition. So we go through energy concepts, carbohydrate, fat, protein, fluid, sodium, and training the gut, as well as dietary supplements. So trying to give a real thorough overview of how all those different aspects of the diet can impact the gut in athletes and then during exercise. And then the final part, I'm not a trained psychologist, but I thought it was really important to devote a good amount of the book's attention to kind of the psychological aspects of gut dysfunction, because there is a really tight connection between your brain and your gut, and even what we call the second brain of the body, which is the kind of internal nervous system that's housed within your gut. So I go through kind of the connections between your gut and your central nervous system, and why being stressed and anxious can kind of throw your gut into a state of disarray. And then provide some suggestions and talk about the research with respect to how you might manage some of those stress-related and anxiety-related gut issues. And then the last couple of sections are just appendices, and those cover gastrointestinal disorders and conditions, and then medications that are used to treat gut issues or that may cause gut issues themselves. So that's a 5-minute overview there of the book. It's roughly a few hundred pages and I think over 700 references. So it is very heavily science-based, but I try and make it as entertaining as possible to read for a book that is based heavily in science.
I definitely needed this book 25 years ago.
Yeah, no kidding.
I was a ball of a mess back then and trying to figure it out. I didn't have those resources. So, Patrick, do you think, gut health has been a topic of, a topic we're seeing more, but do you think we're seeing more gut dysfunction in athletes, or are we just more aware of it now?
I think is probably mostly just an intention thing. When you try and see if there are studies that compare like gut disorders, are they more common or less common in athletes? There isn't really a lot of research there. There was a recent study that did survey work with athletes and asked them about symptoms related to IBS. And I think the results of that study found about a 10% prevalence among athletes, which is kind of in the range of what you'd expect in the general population, depending on how the study is done. So I don't think gut disorders are any more common in athletes. I don't think that's real likely. But what is true is, especially for endurance athletes or others that are training heavily, exercise does put stress on the gut, and some of these issues and symptoms certainly are more likely when someone is training heavily or engaging in heavy exercise. So I think that's kind of the separating point, is that athletes have more issues to deal with because they're doing heavier and more prolonged exercise. And that is when the gut can have a bit of trouble, because your body only has so many resources to go around during exercise, and the gut isn't necessarily the priority. The priority is generally the skeletal muscle, and then also the skin for sweating and to cool you off. So yeah, that would be my take on, is it more common in athletes? I don't necessarily think so, with the exception that because they're engaging in a lot of heavy exercise, that's when they run into problems more often.
I was wondering if, again, like athletes have much more access to different types of intake and fuel and supplements and goos and gobs and gels. So I was wondering do you think if that has any sort of impact on our gut issues, just what we're using?
The types of products
of products.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure. I think in certain athletes, the over ingestion of certain supplements or products could be contributing to some types of symptoms. One thing I try and remind readers of in the book is that the causes of each symptom can vary a lot. So I try not to overgeneralize about, does this cause gut issues? I try and say, is this behavior, is this sort of food product likely to trigger this type of symptom? And more focused on in symptom-specific perspective. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a great answer to that.
Well, and I think that'll help us with our next question. So this is going to be kind of oversimplified, but can you give us like 5 best things that you can do to help protect your gut? What would you list?
Yeah. So just general gut health. I mean, I think a lot of these things are pretty similar in terms of your overall health in general. So number 1 would be following a nutrient-dense, high-quality diet that has a substantial amount of fiber. And that is, to a large extent, going to help with some of the basic functioning of your gut, ensure that you're not experiencing excessive constipation, and help to promote maybe the health of especially your large intestine. If you're really restricting dietary fiber to a great degree, there's some pretty good evidence that could have some negative effects on your intestinal health in the long term. So, I mean, that's true of just general cardiovascular health, probably a risk of certain cancers, is making sure to eat adequate amounts of fiber and following a healthful diet. Another thing that is true of improving your general health is maintaining enough sleep. I don't devote a huge section of the book to sleep, but we know that people who do shift work, who have odd schedules where they're unable to sleep regularly, or for whatever reason they have chronic sleep dysfunction, the risk of things like IBS and other gut problems goes up pretty substantially. And there's even experimental studies where they'll bring people into a lab, or they'll ask them to restrict sleep for a day or two. And you can see perceptions of pain and discomfort going up even after a couple of days when people are sleep deprived. So not only just managing like general pain, but gut discomfort, I think an important thing is do the best you can to get adequate sleep on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Another one would be avoiding kind of gut toxic medications in large amounts. And probably the main one that I would put in that category is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So your ibuprofen, naproxen, aspirin. Taking them once in a while is fine. Everybody has a headache once in a while. Some people have more chronic pain issues they have to deal with. But taking large dosages day after day is really toxic for the gut. It's going to increase the risk of things like ulcers, GI bleeds, and even increases the risk of cardiovascular disease if you take them over the long term. So that's another one I would definitely, especially for athletes who oftentimes have aches and pains that are kind of chronic, be careful about the amount and frequency of NSAID ingestion that you're doing.
That's a really good point. Actually, like as a college athlete, and this was a while ago, we were actually encouraged to take an ibuprofen
Proactively,
before practice.
yep.
Yeah, help with the
Yeah.
pain. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, they're not only nasty on the gut in a number of ways, but they can also potentially interfere with training adaptations if you're taking them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They can exacerbate asthma in people who have
Hmm.
exercise-induced asthma. So they're not good to be taken in large dosages for long periods of time.
point.
So just be careful about
Mhm.
how they're being used. Another big one is stress and anxiety. So I mentioned a third of the book is kind of devoted towards that. And we consistently see people who are reporting more stress and anxiety in their everyday life are more likely to have gut issues, including things like irritable bowel syndrome and functional dyspepsia. But I've even shown this in a couple of studies now that I've done with athletes, that you see a higher report of gut issues during training and competition
Yeah.
among those who are reporting the most stress and anxiety.
Sure. There's a direct highway.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a deep connection between your gut and your brain. So we know they can go both ways, right? How you're thinking and how you're feeling can affect your guts, and things happening in your guts can actually affect your brain. So it's a kind of a two-way street. And what I would say is, if you are someone who deals with some of those stress and anxiety issues, trying to come up with some sort of coping mechanism to at least dampen some of those issues. I mean, it's not always reasonable to think that you're going to completely get rid of them. We live in, a very stressful and anxious world at times. So just doing the best you can in trying to get some consistency with things like maybe mindfulness or deep breathing or those types of strategies.
Great.
So how many, did I hit 4 there, 5 there? I'm not sure where I'm at in terms of numbers. 4. Thanks for catching me up on the count there. Maybe the last one I would say is don't chronically undereat if you're an athlete.
Yeah.
So, yep. Kind of give you that nod to the relative energy deficit in sport. It affects a lot of body systems, and the gut is included in that. It's almost like if you don't eat enough, your gut forgets what it's supposed to do, because you can have, as an example, a slowing of stomach emptying if you're heavily restricting energy intake. And especially for like a runner or a cyclist who's trying to fuel during competition, you don't want slowed stomach emptying. You don't want things sitting in your gut when you're trying to consume enough fluid and carbohydrate to maintain your performance. So that's just one example of how chronically underfueling can impact the digestive process, among many other things that can happen. So I guess those would be 5 pretty safe general rules of thumb when it comes to gut function and health.
Those are great. Do you have any recommendations or just kind of practical things that you do when an athlete's weighing? Should they use some of these sports formulated products, or would it be more convenient? It would be more convenient for them to use that versus like a whole food approach. How do you work with your athletes in that realm?
I would say for most of the time, day to day, if you can choose whole foods, that's going to be the preferable route, because, foods have an array of nutrients and other phytochemicals and other things in them that if you just focus on sports nutrition products or processed products, oftentimes those things are removed and it's not as a complete package. So I would say when possible, try and go with foods from more of a day-to-day basis. That being said, there are situations where selecting a more processed or refined product would be a little bit easier for your body to digest and handle, particularly during heavy exercise. Like, if you're exercising at 75%, 80% of VO2 max and you're running for 1 to 2 hours, eating something like a carbohydrate food that you have to chew and try and swallow down, that's not always going to be the best approach. So I think it comes largely down to athlete preference, experience, and tolerance. But whole foods, if you don't chew them well enough, one downside is they may sit in your stomach a bit longer if you just kind of wolf them down without chewing. So, it's a hard thing to generalize because there's a lot of individual response to different products, and it comes down to kind of that old trial and error recommendation, which I know athletes probably hate, but that's probably the best approach.
That's good. Patrick, you brought a lot of great information today. Again, this is a really popular topic, so thank you for being on. Oh,
of course. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
We love to ask our interviewee how they live out the FIT philosophy. So, how do you balance performance, health, intellect, and time for self? Man, that's a really hard question right now
Right.
during our
Yeah.
times. So,
I'm surprised our guts aren't all jacked
they
up right
probably
now.
are.
Stress,
Yeah.
sleep.
They are. So, how have
All
you
sorts of
been
stuff going on.
figuring it out in general and especially during this time?
I mean, I think one thing that has helped me, and this is just very individual, is just accepting that in certain times you can't do everything well, and you have to just kind of accept that you can't do everything, and that can be difficult. And when it comes to, my physical activity and diet, especially with exercise and trying to remain active, I think one of the things that I have benefited from, not just now, but over the last probably 5 years of my life, when my job makes things more challenging to get into the gym, just with all the responsibilities that you end up having as you get along into your career, is to build physical activity into your daily routine, so it's not as much of a choice. So like I bike to work very frequently. If I drive, I'll park in a neighborhood where I have to walk maybe a quarter mile to a half a mile. So doing things like that where it's just kind of a natural part of my routine helps me fit it in. And when I have so many other, responsibilities, childcare, and those sorts of things. But yeah, it's tough right now. So, and people are in very different situations. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I'm still fully employed, and other people are struggling with just putting food on the table. So it's hard for me to say anything about their situation because it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming on, and I can attest to having read your book once you get started. Of course, I love the gut anyways, but it's an excellent book, so I hope everybody goes out and gets it.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the kind words on that.
Thanks, Patrick. Stay
nice to
safe
get
up
feedback.
there.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye, Queens.
Today's episode is brought to you by yours truly. I'm excited to announce the releasing of my book, Finding Your Sweet Spot in Sport, Avoiding Relative Energy Deficit in Sport, also known as RED-S, by optimizing your energy balance. Be sure to follow me on social media or go to my website, www.beccamccombel.com. Bye, Queens.
For additional information on today's topic and guests, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fit for a Queen. And
Hashtag Fit for a Queen.
don't forget to rate us on iTunes. We can't wait for you to join us next time on Fit for a Queen.
Bye, Queens.